Hello, welcome to Prophecy Pod Radio. Today I am continuing my series on apologetics and how we got our Bible, but I'm taking a slight detour to discuss the inerrancy of the Bible. I'd like to start by saying that the Bible is inspired by God and it's historically trustworthy, and that I believe the originals were without error, that they were inerrant. However, our copies are not inerrant. They do contain errors, and I'd like to go over those errors today. Now, some copyists make mistakes, and I'd like to go over the mistakes that are made when manuscripts are copied. Now, the first error I'd like to discuss is known as a dautography, and a dautography is when a letter has been written twice. It's been written twice that should have only been written once. So, for example, instead of writing below, someone has written bellow. And of course the two words are completely different and they have different meanings, so that's a dautography. Another mistake that sometimes happens is called fission, and that's when one word has been mistakenly divided into two words. So for example, someone may have changed nobody, one word, into no body, two words, no body, which of course is different than nobody. Another error that copyists sometimes make is known as fusion, and that's when the last letter of one word has been combined with the first letter of the next word. So for example, someone may have changed belong, two words, as in it won't be long until we finish, to belong, one word. So that would change the meaning to we won't belong, as in we won't fit in. So there's a difference there between belong, two words, and belong, one word. Now, another error that sometimes occurs is called haplography, and that's when something has been written once that should have been written twice. So in this case, it would have been that instead of writing bellow, we wrote below. So which of course is a different word with a different meaning. And then there is homophony, and that is writing a word with a different meaning for a word that sounds exactly the same. So, for example, instead of writing male, M-A-I-L, the copyist wrote male, M-A-L-E. Or instead of writing break, B-R-A-K-E, they wrote break, B-R-E-A-K. So that's a homophony. And then there's a metathesis, and that's mistakenly changing the order of the letters in a word. So for example, instead of writing foliage, the copy wrote foliage. I'm sorry, that one's even difficult to say. So you can see how they'd make a mistake when they wrote it. Or instead of writing Calvary, the copyist wrote cavalry. So as you can see, those are the kinds of errors that copyists do make when they are copying manuscripts. So those are just some of the errors that will crop up, but the important thing is that even though we may not have manuscripts that are 100% accurate copies of the originals, which I believe were inerrant, we have something very close to that, and our copies are at least 95% textually pure and probably closer to 98% textually pure. But the important thing is that there are no errors that are going to change any doctrine. So even if there are errors, small errors like that, they're not the kinds of errors that are going to change our doctrines, and they're not the kinds of errors that are going to call into question the things that we believe, our core beliefs as Christians. So that's very important to know. And we can come to that number of 95% textually pure or 98% textually pure because we have so many manuscripts. We have over 25,000 manuscript pieces to help us reconstruct the originals of the New Testament documents. And that's how we can get so close to what our originals said. And much of this evidence is very early on. But when we look at other manuscripts of antiquity, we see that their numbers just don't compare, and their copies were made long after the originals were written, yet no one wants to call those manuscripts into question. Now, our New Testament originals were written around 50 to 90 A.D., so these were written shortly after the events, and they were written while eyewitnesses were still living. If the authors of the New Testament were writing things that didn't happen, the eyewitnesses would have corrected them. They certainly had enough critics, and they certainly had people who hated what they were doing and hated what they were teaching, and they would have done anything to stop them. But they weren't able to, because they were telling the truth, and they knew that what they were saying was what had happened. Now today we'd not be able to say that John F. Kennedy was killed in California while riding in a bus with Marilyn Monroe, because there are eyewitnesses who are still alive, and they would quickly correct anyone spreading something like that. So it's important that these manuscripts are written shortly after the events took place, because there were eyewitnesses alive, and there were hostile witnesses alive, and they would have corrected any inerrant, they would have corrected any false stories, and there just wasn't enough time for legends to develop either, because these were written so close to the events, and it takes time for legends to develop. But just as important is that our earliest copies of those original writings were made around 130 AD, so we have a time span there of from when the originals were written to their earliest copies of only 30 years. And this is just unheard of with ancient documents. Homer's Iliad is the next closest ancient document in terms of textual support. I know it has at least 640 copies, and perhaps it has as many as 900, but Homer's Iliad was written in 900 BC, and the earliest copy was made in 400 BC, so that's a time span of 500 years from when the original was written until the earliest copy was made. And it has several hundred manuscript pieces of evidence to support it, yet it just can't compare with the New Testament, neither in terms of the number of copies available and the time span between when the original was written and when the first copy was written. There's just nothing else in antiquity that compares with the New Testament. Plato's Tetralogies was written between 427 and 347 BC, but the earliest copy wasn't written until 1200 years later, and that was written in 900 AD, and there are only 7 copies of Plato's Tetralogies. And Caesar's Gallic Wars was written around 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy of that wasn't made for 1,000 years after that, in 900 AD, and there were only 10 copies. There are only 10 copies of that, yet nobody wants to question the reliability or the authenticity of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Nobody says that never happened, that never occurred. So if critics want to question whether we can trust the New Testament, then they need to question every other ancient author as well. Yet they aren't going to do that, and that's hypocritical. And you also need to know that these people have an agenda. There is an agenda at work here, and it's important to realize that. These critics hate the Bible, and they want to discredit it. They want to make names for themselves, and they certainly want to sell their books. Yet the Bible is going to survive long after the critics' books have fallen out of print and the critics themselves have gone the way of all mankind. The Bible has survived attempt after attempt to destroy it. It has outsold every other book that has ever been written, and it will survive these attacks as well, and it will certainly continue to outsell the books of its critics. Now, Matthew 24:35 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Psalm 102:26 says, "They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be discarded." Psalm 119:89 says, "Your word, O Lord, is eternal. It stands firm in the heavens." And Isaiah 55:11 says, "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." There are critics who like to say that there are thousands upon thousands of errors in our copies of the New Testament, and these critics are destroying the faith of many. I'd hate to stand before God when I die with that on my record. I have enough on my record as it is. But these same critics are skewering the facts, and it's important to know this. While it is technically correct to say that there are thousands upon thousands of textual variations, it's also a fact to say that the vast majority of these thousands of variations are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, In other words, once a variation enters a textual tradition, it gets copied over and over and over and over again, and critics love to count every single one of these copies as though it were a distinct variation, when in reality it's not. And as I said before, we have over 25,000 manuscript pieces of textual evidence to help us reconstruct the originals of the New Testament documents. And much of this evidence is very early on. And because we have so many manuscripts, that's why we can get to within 95 to 98% textual purity, and know that we are 95 to 98% what our New Testaments come within 95 to 98% accuracy of what the originals were. We know what the originals were because we have so many manuscripts that allow us to get back to the originals. The New Testament is by far and away the best attested work in history, and you need to know that. You can trust your Bible. It has not been altered for some nefarious purpose, and it is not corrupted. God is able to deliver His Word exactly as He wants it to be delivered. He hasn't left any books out of it. He hasn't allowed anything to be added into it. He hasn't allowed it to be corrupted. These are God's words, and our God is powerful. A God who is powerful enough to create the universe out of nothing, to fling out the heavens, to create the smallest atom, which is not just, or to create the simple cell, which is anything but simple. It's more complex than the most complex factory on the planet. You know, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. The God who made us, the God who made everything, and the God who Himself became a man in the incarnation of Christ, who lived on this earth, who walked in our shoes, who knows what it's like to suffer, who knows what it's like to be a man, who knows what it's like to be human, who has suffered all of the indignities that life can throw at a person. He's gone through all of that. He knows what it's like to be one of us, because He was one of us, yet He is God. God became a man. He came down from the mountain. He came down to us. He walked with us. You know, Jesus was God wearing sandals, and He walked with us. He talked with us. He left us His Word, and He died for us. The wage for sin is death. But Christ paid that wage on the cross, and we need to accept Him, because the only way to God is through Christ. So I pray that you will take the Bible seriously, and that you will read the Bible, and that you will study the Bible, because this is life, and you need to know what it says, and we can trust the Bible. For God is able to protect and to preserve His Word, and these are His words, and I pray that you won't let the critics destroy your faith. Now that's all that I have time for today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to Prophecy Pod Radio, and I hope you will join me next time.